So the Australian AIDS Memorial Quilt is actually a collection of 97 quilts in the museum, and we officially acquired them in 2011. The Powerhouse Museum has over 500,000 items and a few quilts, but none as significant, I feel, as the memorial quilts. So the American quilts are called the Names Project, and they were the first quilts created to commemorate those lost to HIV and AIDS. An Australian, Andrew Carter, went to America in 1987, and he came back to Australia and decided that we should make our own quilts to commemorate those lost. And the 1st of December 1988 was the first display of Australian quilts. There were 35, and Ida Buttrose launched the project. So the quilts, that was the starting date, and lots of people started making quilts to commemorate their loved ones. They used to travel around the countryside as a kind of educational tool and to commemorate. So they'd be laid out, these massive quilts would be laid out on grass. Darling Harbour, they'd be laid out there. And there were candle vigils to remember those who died from AIDS. So even though the museum has 79 of the quilts, there are more out there in Australia, mainly held with AIDS organisations in each state. And we've mainly got in the museum's collection quilts that reflect New South Wales people. So the quilts came into the museum's collection through the passion of one particular person, Philip Dimont, who was the last convener of the Sydney Quilt Project. So HIV and AIDS was the major infective disease in Australia in the 20th century. And the quilts came out of Australia's response to AIDS and HIV. When we think about a quilt, we often think about a quilt that covers a bed. But these AIDS memorial quilts are about 3.5 metres wide and 3.5 metres high. And they actually contain 8 panels. And each panel refers to one person who has died from AIDS, or maybe more than one. So there are over 800 panels in our quilt collection, and that at least over 1,000 lives are documented in these AIDS quilts. So we've got materials from leather to tickets, to photographs, to teddy bears, to sequins, which of course fall off. So very Mardi Gras, really. There were a fantastic bunch of volunteers who would come to the Castle Hill site at least once a week, and myself and other museum staff would sit and discuss issues of privacy, but also there were other ones who would help sew the backing on, or who would go through the written documents to try and find out if they could get the current address, or research somebody if they're in the public eye. We wouldn't be able to have the collection without their support and without their work, because it's a hell of a lot it's a hell of a lot of work to kind of not only have the 79 quilts, but then have each part numbered. So that's 8. So just a lot of documentation, and really doing it with a sensitive eye and really understanding the impact that it had on Sydney, but Australia and other areas of the world at the time. I mean, I think perhaps it would have been very tricky to acquire the quilts in the 80s and 90s, because it was more political then, because there was more censorship, but also because the grief was so close. And I think we've had time, I'm sure mothers never lose it, or lovers never lose the pain, but we've had a bit of time as a society to see change and to have distance between that massive amount of deaths that happened in our communities. I think the quilts are a sign of social change as well. It's fantastic. So you can talk about multiple issues with one quilt. You can talk about design, you can talk about death, you can talk about discrimination, you can talk about health, you can talk about social change, you can talk about how the state and federal governments actually work together, which is remarkable, how the health departments actually supported each other, how the communities at risk were actually listened to during HIV and AIDS, which is an unusual approach and a fantastic approach, which is why we were so successful at flattening the curve, as we call it, or just lowering the infection rate with each panel. And the panels were made by the loved ones of those who had died from AIDS. And each panel, sometimes it came with an information sheet and a permission slip. So we had, when there was one, we had it, and we tried to work out if we could show the name of the person who died to the public, because we didn't want to expose people who hadn't come out or who hadn't given permission when the quilts were made. So they were made in the 1980s and 90s. Sometimes we had nothing. We didn't know any more about what was on the panel than the name, and it could just be Bill or Ted and didn't give us the whole name. Sometimes we had the name of the maker, and if we did and they said it was okay in this permission slip, we've put it on the web. So our goal was in 2007 to acquire, conserve and digitise the images of the 97 AIDS quilts that we have. But we were the first museum in the world to acquire its own country's quilt collection. The other thing that I've found interesting is why the quilts were created. And it was really interesting to hear from Philip Dumont, who was the last quilt convener, and his brother also passed away from AIDS, that it was basically to have a memorial that you could see, that you could actually personalise to reflect the interests of the person who died. The second convener from the Sydney Quilt Project, Libby Woodham, said that it was important to have a quilt because sometimes there were no markings of where you could remember people. People were cremated and their ashes thrown in the ocean or in a park. So what kind of permanent, semi-permanent memorial did you have? And she said, you know, without these, where would you mourn? Where would you recognise the people that have passed? I've added a few stories to the website, and one that was really interesting and moving was a man called Tony Vincent, who was a musician, but his wife Susie died, and his son Troy died. So Susie was a New Yorker dancer, and he created her panel. When Andrew Carter approached him and said, "Do you want to make a panel for Susie?" He didn't originally, Tony. He found it too painful, but he reconsidered and found that the process of making was actually a process of grieving and was helpful to him. And friends helped him make it because he said he had no creative bones in his body, or basically couldn't sew or quilt. And then his son died at the age of 7, about 5 years after that, and he had acquired HIV while he was in the womb. So Troy has beautiful things embroidered around his panel. He went to Coogee Public School, and the kids in the school did a lovely little panel from year 2 there. He loved nature and different activities, and you can see it reflected in the beautiful design of the panel. So it's really moving to have those stories, but also to see what each symbol means on the panel, and that would be fantastic to have more meaning of the symbols on the panels. The quilt that's on display at the Uni New South Wales Art Gallery is one that depicts and recognises the leather pride groups within the queer community. I think it's fantastic to be able to take one quilt out of the 79 and put it on display and research it and get experts to come and talk about what's important about it, because we don't have the chance to look at all of the quilts in detail. So I'm really happy that it's out there, and that this particular quilt will be looked at in terms of its significance of leather in queer community.